Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for listening. I don't know if you're like me in the sense that you love stories and storytelling. And you may not have thought about storytelling as a way to develop language skills. Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about how storytelling, and in particular, the personal narrative, helps kids who struggle with language-based learning challenges. My guest today is Carol Karp. She's a pediatric clinical speech language pathologist who holds 2 master's degrees, one in education and one in communicative disorders, which gives her a unique perspective of kids who think and learn differently. She's here today, and this is her second time on the podcast. I can't wait to jump into this conversation. Let's listen in.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hello, Carol. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Karen. I'm so excited to be here today, and thank you for inviting me.
Yes, and I'm glad you're here. And you are the first person who has appeared twice on the podcast.
Oh
so I'm very excited about that. You know, we just hit 10,000 downloads earlier this month of the podcast. And it's a great time for you to come back because I think that, you know, the information that you shared was so important the first time, and we can expand on that in our discussion today. But again, I'm glad for you to be here to celebrate those downloads.
I'm really honored, and I'm honored also just in terms of the incredible community that you have been able to create from your ideas, and that you've been able to implement them so successfully, and then the huge difference that you've made for people. I'm very honored to be here.
Well, thank you. And like I was saying to you before, it's about all of us doing this work, right? We're all wanting to make a bigger impact, to reach more families, to make sure more kids are understood and get the support they need in order to reach their full potential. And we're all in that work together. So thank you.
Yes, we are.
So we had a discussion that led up to this podcast, and it was about meeting kids where they are. And I think that is so important in terms of the work that we do. When I'm doing assessment and I'm making recommendations, that's such an important part of the recommendation because it also speaks to the frustration that kids have experienced when you don't meet them where they are. So I would love for you to talk about what you mean by meeting kids where they are and why it's important.
Well, meeting them where they are is figuring out what they can and can't do, but also having conversations with them about their interests, what they like to do, what makes them happy, what they don't like to do. But even more than that, I mean, I can give you an example of a child that I worked with who, when this child came in, she just looked at me and said, "You can't make me talk," and sat down and kind of just looked at me with an unhappy look on her face. And I said, "You're right. I absolutely cannot make you talk." And she had been a child who'd been made fun of for many years for how she spoke. So the last thing she wanted to do was go to someone and talk to them. And we started out by using sign language. I had this Sesame Street book that had simple signs in it. And that's how we started communicating with each other. That's what she was comfortable with using those signs. And then going from signs to sounds to words to communication. But in some ways, it was like being a parent when you're figuring out with your baby, how can I communicate with this baby? And I had to take many, many steps backwards, where she was, in order to bring her forwards.
Right. And it wasn't that she was nonverbal.
No, she wasn't a selective mute. No.
Right. So it was really her being uncomfortable with the way she spoke and her ability to express language. And she wasn't comfortable engaging with you in that way.
No, absolutely not. And she let me know. And it's like saying, I mean, someone saying to you, you can't make me talk. It's like saying, you can't make me go to the bathroom. You can't make me eat. You can't do all those things. And I couldn't make her talk, but eventually I figured out how to get her to talk.
Right. And so that's what you mean, kind of like when you say meeting kids where they are. She wasn't ready to begin having a conversation with you.
No.
Which would be part of her intervention. You had to kind of take a few steps back in order to get her there and to get her on board.
Yeah, I had to seduce her to talk by meeting her where she was and making it something that she felt comfortable with. I mean, another child that I worked with that was a selective mute. She clearly didn't come in and say, I won't talk. She just didn't talk. And we started out by playing nonverbal games and then adding sounds and then adding words and then adding some sentences. But I had to, again, go really far back just with getting her to make eye contact and play games or throw a ball back and forth, things like that. It's just like you can't work in a traditional sense all of the time because you're going to miss out. You're going to miss the boat.
Right. And I'm wondering what would have happened if you hadn't done that. If you'd really pushed. It seems that you lose a lot of kids in the therapeutic process when you don't meet them where they are.
Oh, this kid would have just shut down. I had this other incident that happened that was really, really funny. I was working with somebody who really had significant word retrieval problems and really terrible articulation. I mean, many sounds in error. So we were working on articulation. And the child was repeating, she was repeating the sounds, and I was saying, good job. She made a mistake. And I said, oh, let's do that one again. She looked at me and said to me, and this is like a 7-year-old, she said, I just wanted to see if you were listening to me. She said, you sound like you're an automatic pilot. Good job. And I said, you're right.
That's very observant.
Yeah. It was kind of the end of the session. So the next time she came in, we started to talk, and she said, I have so many stories inside my own head. She said, I have this story that's been going on for 4 years inside my own head. It's a continuous story. And when I get bored in school, I just go to my story. I said, can you tell me your story? And she said, no, it's way too complicated. I can't explain it. I said, can you draw your story? She said, yeah. So she started to draw her story. Then eventually she talked about it. But what we ended up doing for articulation therapy is we used her story because I could easily use those same techniques just for connected speech. I got to hear about her and her personal narrative, but we used the personal narrative for articulation therapy. So it's a really non-traditional way of working. But for this kid, if I had stayed with the traditional way of working on articulation, it wouldn't have worked.
And that's really important because I think that, before we started this conversation, I gave your background that you're a speech language pathologist. And so you work with kids who have articulation difficulties, who also have problems with expressive language, receptive language. And what I'm hearing you say is that there are approaches to treatment, which we learn in our trainings, but there are also other things that we can do to connect with students, to connect with the children that we work with in order to be able to utilize some of the other intervention methods. And it sounds like the personal narrative is one of those things.
Absolutely. And it's interesting too, because Faye in 2004 found that children who can tell a story well are more accepted by their peers. So it's also important socially, because if you think about how we spend our time, we spend our time talking to people about our private stories, a lot of times, about how we react to situations. And if you don't have the ability to do that, and people don't have the ability to understand you, it can be kind of lonely.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Let's talk about what you mean by personal narrative, because you've mentioned it twice. What is a personal narrative? And then we'll talk about kind of how that relates to language development.
Okay. A personal narrative is everyone tells a story about themselves in their own head. Constantly, we're always telling stories inside our own heads. And a story makes you what you are. We build ourselves around the stories that we tell ourselves. We share information, we communicate our ideas and experiences, we describe, we joke, we entertain, and the ability to link ideas together using language is how we do spend lots of our time doing that. And a major part of all social interaction is the story. And the story that the person constructs from memory about experiences really does extend into conversation. For example, can you imagine if you don't have a personal narrative? If you can't explain what has happened to you, if you're on the yard at school and something happens to you and you're crying and an adult comes over and they want to help you, they can't help you if you can't explain. And people aren't always that understanding. It's also really important for academics because there are studies that have shown by having a more complicated personal story, that extends into written language. It extends into what you write, your expository writing, your narrative writing becomes more complicated because you have a story to tell. So did I explain that well?
You did. And I guess one of the things I'm wondering is the personal narrative always about something that has actually happened to you, or it can also be about kind of things that you want to happen or that you're thinking about. So when that student came in and said, I have stories in my head, is it about things that have actually happened to her
No.
or things that she's dreaming about or hoping for?
They're stories that they're kind of action stories.
Mm-hmm.
And they are not things that have happened. So the personal narrative can be fictional, but it can also be what has happened to you. Younger children tend to tell personal narratives that they've experienced. As you get older, you might tell a more fictional one also. So there are those different components.
Right. And so how does the personal narrative develop? When you talk about younger versus older children, how does it develop?
It develops at birth. When there's imitation. There's imitation at birth. Andrew Meltzoff did that the imitation with the babies, where he stuck his tongue out and the babies imitated him immediately. So there's imitation immediately. So I would say that's how your personal narrative starts. It's by interaction. And it begins between the relationship between parents and children. It's nonverbal communication in the beginning and turn taking. And then parents usually add verbalizations to that interaction. Like if somebody's crying and you say, oh, you must be hungry, let me give you your bottle. The child may not understand those words initially. They do understand intonation patterns. They do understand the nonverbal smiles. But they start to put words together with the nonverbal. It begins with sounds, with words. By 2 years of age, children can tell a story. And it might be as simple as somebody holding up a cereal bowl and saying, Mama, more, want more. That's really talking about a past tense experience because the cereal's all gone. So that's really the beginning. There's also a lot that's written about, Fivish has written a lot out of Emory about narration style between parents and children. And early on, parents who ask more questions that are who, what, when, where questions. Those are like really easy answers. They're memory questions. But parents who ask why and how questions get a very different answer from their children. And there's more of a conversation that can start with those kinds of questions. And also, when parents tell more complicated or embellished narratives to their children, that also really helps. And there's co-construction. I mean, it's really important that the narratives, that there is co-construction, because you don't want it to be where you're telling the child all the facts. You want it to be interactive, and you want it to have elaboration. And there's a real sense of self that develops through these stories that can't be duplicated by technology. And I mean, I wonder about that with all this online schooling. Who knows? But Pat Kuhl did those early studies where she taught children Chinese, and she didn't, but she had people teaching them Mandarin. And some people did it by a television working with a kid, and the other group did it one-to-one in person. And the children, again, who had developed a relationship with somebody and were learning the language, they learned better than the kids who were being taught by a TV.
And that makes sense, because if you think about language, it develops in a social context.
Right.
And so having an individual there and having that back and forth, and being able to see those nonverbal cues and those nonverbal expressions that go with the narrative or the story are so important. And when I hear you talk about the personal narrative, it makes me think about storytelling and reading, particularly when you talk about imitation, because we know that storytelling, reading to babies, to children, promotes brain growth, promotes language development and imagination. And I'm wondering if that also helps children develop a personal narrative, because you get to see the sequence of a story from beginning, middle, and an end. And that starts helping kids to think about their own story and things that have happened to them.
Right. And I think even if you look at a simple story like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, it starts out once upon a time, there are three bears. It gives the name. They all lived in a tiny house in the forest. A girl named Goldilocks comes by. She was surprised to see the house. She noticed it was empty. She went inside to find the three bears. She ate the baby bear's food. The bears return. She has to run away. That is, there's a setting, there's an initiating event, there's an internal response, there's a consequence, and there's a reaction. So that is teaching story grammar. That is teaching how to tell a story. And when children are really little, they'll tell stories and they're not in sequence. And that's kind of what you expect. But parents can add the sequence. Like if a child says something like, I ran in the park, I ate lunch. You might say, did you run in the park first? And then did you eat lunch? And then you say, oh, first you ran in the park, then you ate lunch. So you're adding those sequence words, and they can take those in and start to use those in their own stories.
Right. Absolutely. And that's, again, another demonstration of how you can enhance the language skills, particularly in kids who are struggling with the development of language, by kind of helping them fill in the blanks and the missing pieces of their own storytelling ability. And then at the same time, modeling storytelling for them, and helping them to develop their personal narrative at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's something, the personal narrative is something you can rely on. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is sometimes children develop a negative personal narrative.
Mm.
And so that takes some intervention too.
And what does that look like when you talk about a negative personal narrative?
I can't do that. I've had kids who've hit themselves on the head and say, I can't do that. I'm stupid. I don't know how to talk. I would say that's a negative.
Right.
Yeah, it's a really negative way of thinking about yourself. And that's actually why it's really important to get in there early, because you want to get in there before somebody develops that negative self-talk. Middle school is it's late. It's late. I mean, you can do it, but it's late. But curriculum demands are really different in middle school. And if you're working with someone, for example, with vocabulary problems, you're going to need to do vocabulary more around the curriculum. And so it's hard to start in middle school. And also just you don't want someone to develop that negative self-talk. With this one child who came in who had that negative self-talk, this was a child who had a neuropsych eval. The neuropsych eval had revealed significant, word retrieval problems, but a very, very high verbal IQ, which was, was superior, which was really frustrating for that child. And that child came in like hitting himself on the head and saying that he was a stutterer, and that's why he couldn't talk. And he didn't stutter. And he had word retrieval issues. He couldn't find words. And I had to go to the DSM and kind of read it to him about what his language would look like if he actually was fluent. And the most difficult part about it was he had defined himself in one way. He was angry at me that he had to learn to define himself in another way.
That's interesting. That's really interesting because, you and I both work with kids who have language-based learning challenges, and you work on the intervention side. And how does that play a role? I mean, you're describing almost like an emotional response to the difficulties a child is experiencing. But it sounds like having that language-based weakness also contributes to even having the words to string together to form a personal narrative. So what does it look like when it isn't developing as expected, and what does that mean for a child?
Well, in this case, he did have a personal narrative. It was just really negative. So we had to change it. And I had to talk to him about how he talks. Just kind of talk to him about, well, what part of talking is really different. And he said, I have the words. He was very articulate. He said, I have the words in my head. I can't say them. And I said, there's actually a word for that. It's called the tip of the tongue phenomenon. And so you have the words in your head, you can't find them and you can't say them. And I'm going to help you with that. And we talked about conversation and the fact that if he couldn't find a word and he was slower to find it, that he needed to answer, because that's part of conversation. There's a give and take in conversation. So what you need to do is you need to tell your listener, I need a minute. Let me think about that. I'm going to describe it to you. And we talked about circumlocutions, talking around words so that you get your point made. And he was a kid who could use strategies. He started using those strategies and he became a more effective communicator. And that's really what it's about. And he has stopped hitting himself in the head and saying, I can't do that. I'm not smart. He doesn't say I'm not smart anymore. He'll say, we were having a conversation recently and he said, give me a minute. I need to think about that. And I was like, yes.
That's using the strategies that you're giving him. But I think also that you change the negative narrative, the negative personal narrative, when you start seeing improvements in your ability to communicate, which is what you're saying happens with treatment.
Right. And the other thing was, whenever we would try to do something written, he would always say, oh, my hand hurts. Writing is just really hard for me. I had to write a lot at school today. And my hand hurts. He doesn't say that anymore because he can organize his thoughts. And so I think that it's kind of finding a different way of working.
Mm-hmm. And, when I think about language and I think about the sequence of language, particularly when we're talking about a personal narrative or storytelling, there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, there's a purpose behind what you're saying. We have a history of telling stories and storytelling, and storytelling has not only been used for entertainment. It's been used to share a history, to teach lessons, to share cultural beliefs and values.
Oral history. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And that also gives a person a sense of self and
sense of belonging.
Yes, a sense of belonging. And so there's a direct kind of connection between storytelling and your personal narrative, because it connects you to who you are, connects you to your community, your culture, your family. Absolutely. And imagine not having that, or not feeling like you can connect or you have a personal narrative.
No, it's funny because I remember going to the musical Fiddler on the Roof with my grandfather. And he looked at me afterwards and he said, "Oy vey, we didn't have the time to sing and dance. We were worried about the pogroms." So it is important. I mean, that was his personal narrative.
Right.
And then I got it. And so life was different than they're portraying it.
Right. But then it also goes back to what you said initially about how important communication is and this personal narrative for developing relationships, from sharing your experiences with another person that helps you to connect with them around what it is that you're sharing, which, builds relationships. And imagine not being able to do that.
I can't imagine not being able to do that. And maybe because there's so much acceptance and comfort in those moments.
Right. So what can parents do to help a child who is struggling with that personal narrative, those language-based issues that impact their ability to tell their story?
I think one of the very first thing they can do is, it sounds so simple, is slow down interaction. We're all so quick. And for kids who are slow processors or have receptive language issues, you need to slow it down, and you need to encourage questions about, am I not, as the parent, am I not asking a clear question? Can you help me? I need your help so that we can have this conversation. We're going to do this together. I won't let you down, but we're going to do this together. So it's a lot of listening to the child, as you talked about, sharing books and story retell. Starting without story structure is what kids do. So we talked about that, adding structure to their stories, telling stories together. And with older kids, it's even like, let's talk about what we did on Sunday. And phones have become such a great tool for pictures. So you can use pictures of what you've done, so that those help the verbalization. Or even if a kid can't find a word, if they're looking at a picture, you can say, "Oh, can you point to that picture? Can you point to what you mean?" So that can really help that communication. And make up stories with them and ask questions. That can also help. And as they get older, reading more complicated stories together and retelling them. Because kids, I've noticed, I used to have kids like to keep diaries, almost draw them. Kids don't seem to want to do that anymore. So it's really looking for other, strategies.
Mm-hmm. And then I'm going back to what you said earlier about the who question, where question versus the why and the how. So using those kinds of questions when you're discussing stories or their experiences or what's happening in the picture, why do you think
why might that
character did that? Right.
What might happen next? Using prediction. And also with those kinds of questions, there's no right or wrong answer. So I think that takes the judgment out of it. And when a child says what might happen next, you can go with that and say, "Oh, what would that be like? If that happens, what's something else that might happen? How can we change that story?" So talk about changing stories too, because then you can relate that, how they can change their own stories. And one of the most popular assignments in all schools is how you relate to the text. And so that becomes really important because you have to have a personal narrative in order to pick out how you can relate to a protagonist or an antagonist in a text. Or I know some schools are using that book, They Persisted, talking about persistence. When's the time that you've persisted? How does our family face difficult times?
Mm-hmm. So connecting the story to their own personal experiences, help develop that personal narrative. So we know you talked a little bit about how parents can support the development of the personal narrative. You are a speech language pathologist. How do you intervene, and how can other speech language pathologists who are listening, intervene and help support the development of a personal narrative?
Well, I think the first thing that we do is really gather information before we see kids, because I may have a neuropsych report from someone. So that's really great if I have that as a start. And then I might need to do an evaluation, speak with parents, speak with the school, take a developmental history. The most important thing when that child comes in is talk with that child. Just talk with them. Are they using lots of fillers? Can they explain their thoughts? I remember a child that I had that came in that I said everything I asked the child said, my parents know. My parents know. I asked my parents know. And I said, oh, well, what do your parents tell you? My parents know. So that was a really good answer. Adults love that answer. But there was nothing that was this easy answer that this child had come up with because he couldn't explain. So you need to look at that, and you need to look at if they're using fillers. Thing, you know what I mean? Thingamajig. Or if they're being clear about their intention and come up with strategies for that. You can use a story retell as part of your evaluation, language sample of connected speech. And then you come up with a plan. Maybe you need to do a lot of vocabulary work that promotes flexibility of thinking. And you do these lessons that might work on flexibility at the same time that you're working on the personal narrative. Because the personal narrative you might work on when they come in and you say, oh, what'd you do this week? And then, but you're also working on, you might need to work on syntax. You might need to work on specific parts of language to support that personal narrative so that they can generate a personal narrative.
Right. And that kind of brings me back to what you were saying before about, if a child is not able to express ideas, thoughts in sequence, that you help them with that. I think you used the example of, I was at the park, I ate lunch, and then you ask, well, what did you do first? Right. And then it seems like modeling that. Oh, so you ate lunch and then you went to the park. Right. So you help them with the development of that language.
You help them sequence, you help them make sense of their story, because there are certain signs that the narrative isn't developing. Like, you can't sequence ideas together. There's no beginning, middle, or end to a story. I mean, have you ever had a child tell you a story, or an adult, where you can't make heads or tails of it? It's like the events aren't connected. There's no cohesion. Nothing is connected. And imagine going through life with having things aren't connected.
Right. And I think that's really important, Carol, because sometimes parents will see that or hear that, but won't necessarily see that there's a need for intervention or speech, because and I think that has to do with not understanding speech language pathologist work. And sometimes you think it's articulation, or you think, oh, you only need it if the kid's not speaking, when in fact, what you just described explains why speech language pathology intervention would be so important.
Right, because it's important just in your everyday life, in your interactions, but academically, It's really important too. Those stories will show no cause and effect. It's like they're individual events that happen and they're not connected in any way. And then you'll see that poor word retrieval and the use of thing and all of those fillers instead of specific words. And there's trouble putting thoughts into words and they can't say what's happened to them. So early intervention is really important for that personal narrative. There was a child that I saw once who any question, and this child was already in first grade, any question you asked the child said chocolate or whatever. If you said, how's the weather? They said chocolate. And this was a really smart kid who had incredible word retrieval issues. So since chocolate was a favorite word, we started out by eating chocolate and talking about what it tasted like and talking about other candies. Got fat with that one. and rating candies and which ones we liked and which ones we didn't like. And how do you make chocolate chip cookies? And then there's that book, Mistakes That Worked, that talks about it's a great book. But one of the stories is about the woman who invented chocolate chip cookies, how it was a mistake. So we talked about how you could look at this what's your favorite cookie? Oh, it's chocolate chip cookies. Well, this was a mistake for this woman. And we went that was how we started language.
Right. And I think that really speaks to, again, meeting kids where they are. One of the things we started talking about is the fact that we need to meet kids where they are. And that helps to engage them when you structure the intervention around their interests. So if it's chocolate, if it's chocolate chips, if it's art, if it's an artist that they like, you use that to help develop language. And I think that's something that parents can use as well.
Oh, I think absolutely. Especially if it's art. I mean, there's so many art books that you can look at. I did something with someone about this was a child who thought very deeply. And so we did Rodin's The Thinker. And we talked about the pose. And we imitated the sculpture. And what does that tell you? He's got his hand up to his forehead. What's he doing? What does that even tell you about nonverbal communication? What do you like to think about? What are some thoughts about how the world works that keeps you up at night? It was a wonderful way of working.
Mm-hmm. Now, are there multicultural variations in narrative production?
There are multicultural variations. I think for me is one of the most really interesting things I learned was that the norms for story grammar are taken from 1979 and 1980. And that's a long time ago. And cultural variations were not taken into account in 1979 and 1980. So when you're looking at story production, we need to take into consideration those variations when we're analyzing story grammar. All the tests that we give, like the test of narrative language, they're all based on those norms.
Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like you'd have to interpret that data with caution. So
I would think so.
People who aren't familiar with norms, it's what we kind of use to gauge what is expected for a child of a certain age. But if we're using those norms from kids from the 1970s, there could be some changes historically and developmentally that we have to think about when we're looking at how they score on those tests.
I think so. For example, some cultures might tell linear stories. The reference to time, in others, the reference to time isn't important. It might be more of an emphasis on setting and detail. So they're not going to, if you've been told stories a certain way, you're not going to tell stories the same way. The one universal that was mostly found is that there's usually a protagonist seeking to solve challenges. So that was something that was universal, mostly universal. But I do think that that's something that absolutely needs to be taken into account.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, we've been talking about the personal narrative. We've also been talking about storytelling. And as we talk about kind of multicultural variations, I'm thinking back to storytelling, and storytelling is rooted in culture. Children develop an understanding of themselves as human beings, their feelings, their culture, their beliefs, their place in the world through storytelling. And so being able to develop that personal narrative is so important in terms of, like we've been saying, connecting with other people. And they need to have the language skills in order to do that. And the work that you do in helping them develop those language skills is critical.
Oh, it's absolutely critical. What we're trying to do is we're trying to help children solve problems through the personal narration and communication.
Right. And so it's important, we have the language skills. We need the language skills to form that personal narrative. And then that personal narrative helps with social connection, social sharing, helps with learning, and again, enhances a sense of self and helps to engage kids in the learning process. Imagine how excited you are to come home and tell your parents what you learned today at school, right? It just enhances that engagement. And it's just wonderful that you're doing this work to help kids develop that skill.
Well, thank you. I feel like it's a very untraditional, it's not the traditional way of working. I do.
You don't think it's traditional?
No.
But it's important. What do we do when we're speaking with each other? We're telling stories. We're expressing what it is that we're doing and what we're going to do and what our dreams are. And it's important for who we are and how we're connected to each other.
Well, it seems like there's really nothing that's more important. That's what life's about, is being able to connect with people. And that's how you understand people. We can't understand people. It's harder to understand people if we can't talk to them and share ideas.
Right. And share who we are, because that's what the personal narrative is.
And develop an appreciation of someone that's different than you. We don't all have to be the same. I can explain why I think, I have this funny thing going with my kids. I say Century City Mall is an indoor mall, and they say it's an outdoor mall. And I explain to them why it's an indoor mall, and they explain to me why it's an outdoor mall. But we just have this funny communication going about it. We disagree. That's so important, but it's just kind of funny. And I'll say, oh, you want to go to that indoor-outdoor mall?
So what is a takeaway for parents listening, for educators listening about the personal narrative that you want people to remember?
Listen to your children, that we all have personal narratives going on inside of our heads, positive and negative, all the time. And if we can get kids to share their personal narratives and what they're thinking about, then we can really work with them, be close with them, help them solve problems, and communicate.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carol. This has been really great. And if parents, educators want to get in touch with you to learn more about the work that you do, about the personal narrative, speech language pathology, what is the best way for them to reach you?
The best way to reach me is, I think my website is on there, and I think my email. My email is actually really great.
And I'll be sure to put it in the show notes so people can reach out to you.
Okay. Thanks, Karen. I appreciate your having me again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here. If you are a speech language pathologist and you are committed to helping kids who think and learn differently further develop their language skills, their communication skills, we want to hear from you. Please email me at drkiwilson@childnexus.com and let's talk about how we can work together. We would love to have you in this community. Let's start with a conversation. Thanks so much for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.